So tonight we're going to close out Hebrews chapter 11.
You sure?
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, not the last two verses, because the last two verses of Hebrews 11 really go with chapter 12. So we're going to pick those up when we do next week, do chapter 12. They really don't fit. Whoever the monk was that made chapters and verses made a mistake. And
Oh,
those
God.
two verses should have gone with chapter 12.
No, God didn't put in chapters and verses.
Right.
No.
Maybe he ran out of candles.
Yeah. It may have been true.
Our monkey business.
So
Like you
anyway,
said, we might not finish.
so we're coming to the last verses. We could spend weeks. So what we're doing in these last verses is the writer of Hebrews lists events that involve faith activities, but no specific people. And if we were going to try to tie all these individual events that the writer of Hebrews wrote to individual people, which we could do, it would be a long study. We're not going to do that. We're going to do a survey of it and pick some of the things and talk about some of them. So we can move on into Hebrews chapter 12, which is actually a very rich passage that we'll get started with next week. So we're going to be, as we look at these last verses in Hebrews 11, we're going to be reminded that putting our faith in God does not mean everything in life will be wonderful.
No.
Just because we have faith in God doesn't mean that life is going to be beautiful. Well, life will be beautiful because we have God, but it's not going to be easy. We're not promised easy. We're not promised no trouble in life. In fact, we're promised the opposite of that.
And if somebody tells you that, they're lying.
That's right. And so we're going to talk through that tonight. Let's get into our passage. It's Hebrews chapter 11, verses 33 to 38. If someone could read that. Hebrews 11, 33 to 38.
Who through faith have subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth.
There you go.
Okay. Pretty sober discussion there. So let's just talk about some of these things that are mentioned in these verses. We're going to start with stop the mouths of lions.
Well, that's Daniel.
And we're going to talk about Daniel. There are three other men in the Old Testament who fought and defeated lions. Who were they?
Samson.
David.
David, Samson. There's one other.
Daniel.
Pardon?
And Daniel.
Uh,
Daniel in the lion's den?
yeah, he
Or
didn't
Daniel in
defeat.
the-
That's a little. He didn't kill them. He just
sat there looking at him.
survived them.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking of. There's one other guy in 2 Samuel 23:20. His name is Benaiah, one of David's mighty men.
Oh, that's right.
He fought a lion in
In
a pit on
In
a
a pit.
snowy day. It
That's right.
says.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing. But however, only Daniel faced lions. didn't kill them and yet survived in Daniel chapter 6.
Yeah, they didn't bother it.
So here's the story. Daniel was old. By this time, he was in his 80s at least. He was serving as one of the top 3 administrators for Darius of the Persian Empire. And Daniel was exceptional in his work. He had a bunch of other administrators who were jealous of him, and they were trying to figure out a way to bring him down. And they thought, well, he's got to be doing something in his work that we can, there's got to be a kink in his armor. We're gonna find it. They couldn't find anything. He was so honest. He worked with such great integrity. There was nothing wrong. And they're going, rats, spoiled again. So they came up with a scheme to convince Darius that put in a short-term law for 30 days to prevent anyone from praying to anybody but Darius, feed his ego. And the penalty was to be thrown in a lion's den with a bunch of half-starved lions. They kept these lions very hungry so that anytime they threw somebody in, they would kill them immediately. Daniel knew about this law. If you read the story in Daniel chapter 6, he knew what was going on. But did he stop praying? No. What did he do? He prayed. He had a balcony where he lived. He had a balcony that faced Jerusalem. And he would go out 3 times a day on the balcony and pray to God, get down on his knees and pray to God. He made no effort to hide it. He didn't care if people were looking. He was not going to change his attitude toward God just because of this law. He had his faith in God. He felt God was greater than anything that these people were going to do.
Daniel also by this time had gotten to the point in his life and his faith that he was not impressed with someone who was a king at all.
No.
He wasn't impressed with their kingship or their royalty or nothing. He's like, yeah, keep it to yourself.
So, of course, all his enemies found out about it and went to Darius, and Darius was forced to carry out the judgment of the law and throw Daniel into the lion's den. And Darius was upset because he liked Daniel. He was getting ready to make Daniel the #1 administrator over the entire kingdom because God blessed him and he was doing so well. And Darius had to put Daniel in the lion's den because of the law that he signed. Now he regretted. And it's interesting that Darius couldn't sleep all night. Could not sleep. He was restless. And he got up early in the morning, and before he even made it to the den, he was yelling for Daniel, Daniel, did your God save you? And Daniel said, sure did. Even though I haven't done anything, my God shut the mouths of the lions. God showed himself very powerful to Darius. And I don't believe Daniel's faith was so much exercised when he was in the lion's den. It was exercised when he continued praying despite the consequences.
Mhm.
That's when he exercised his faith. Proof that he had faith. He just trusted God. I love this story about Daniel. What a man of God. I'm looking forward to getting to heaven and meeting Daniel. I know there's going to be a lot of other people who want to, so it may take me a few eons, but we're going to have it in eternity. Okay, so the next one that's mentioned there is quench the power of fire. Who does that make you think of?
Shadrach, Meshach, and the Billy Goat.
Yeah. Hananiah, Azariah, and I can't remember their Hebrew names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So talking about quenching fire. So here's Nebuchadnezzar. Here's their story. Nebuchadnezzar, it's in Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful dictator anybody's ever known of. Anything he said was carried out immediately. even if it contradicted something he said 2 minutes before. Whatever came out of his mouth got done. And so he decided, this was after he had the dream about the big image and all this stuff. And Daniel had been the one that God gave Daniel the interpretation for his dream. And Daniel went into Nebuchadnezzar and said, here's what your dream means. I believe that whole thing just pumped up Nebuchadnezzar's pride
His
and
ego.
ego. And that's why he built this image. And then he said, everybody's got to bow down to the image. Well, for some reason, Daniel was out of the picture. I think that's because
He was in a different city.
he was in a different place. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's 3 friends, were there, and they refused to bow down to this image. And so the first commandment was of the 10 commandments is don't bow down to any God other than Jehovah God. And so Daniel's friends loved God and trusted him, and they would not dishonor God. I love how they responded to Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm going to read it. It's Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 to 18. And here's what it says. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." That's pretty strong. "If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So basically they said, we're not going to worship your image. God can rescue us, but he may not. And even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your gods. That's pretty courageous. But that courage is based on their faith in God. They believed God could rescue them. And even if he didn't, what harm could they could kill their bodies, but they knew that they would go to be with God anyway. And so God did rescue them. And he demonstrated, God said, yeah, I'm going to rescue you. And it was had a very powerful impact on Nebuchadnezzar. They were thrown into this fiery furnace, had been heated, 10 times hotter than normal?
7 times.
Or 7 times hotter. It killed the soldiers that threw them in. They died of the heat. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the only thing that burned was the ropes that bound them. Their clothes, nothing else.
Their hair wasn't singed.
Didn't even smell like smoke. God rescued them.
There were 3 men.
Okay, let's talk about escaped the edge of the sword. And in this example, I think of Hezekiah and Isaiah in 2 Kings 18 and 19. Martha and I just read this in our daily Bible studies. We're reading through the Bible. There's really many examples of men who escaped the edge of the sword, but this situation with Hezekiah and Isaiah stand out to me. This incident happened late in the southern kingdom of Judah, when the northern kingdom of Israel had already been overrun by the Assyrians. The king of Assyria wanted to also defeat Judah and Jerusalem. So he sent a messenger to Hezekiah, who delivered a message to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And you read that message, he mocked God.
Yes.
He mocked God. And he didn't do it just once, twice. He came once, and then he came back again and said basically the same thing. He mocked. Who is God that he can rescue you
It's God
from
that
us?
sent me to do this.
Yeah, he even said, it's God that sent me to do this. What? So, Hezekiah and Isaiah took the Assyrian message to God and put their faith in God for deliverance. From a military perspective, they didn't have a chance. The Assyrians were the military powerhouse, and it was unmatched. Nobody could defeat them at the time. But God told them, don't worry. He told Isaiah, who shared it with Hezekiah, don't worry. I'm going to take care of this. You know what happened? That night, the king of Assyria went back to his, it was Sennacherib, he went back to his encampment where they had a lot of soldiers. And during the night, God killed 185,000 soldiers in that camp. They woke up to 185,000 dead bodies. It's not advisable to mock God.
No,
Someday God will carry out his judgment on a mocking world. We studied through Revelation. We saw it. It's not going to be pretty. But Hezekiah and Isaiah trusted God, and God honored their faith. And God was glorified through it all. There's a pattern here. When God does mighty things, he is always glorified. Always. God will always be glorified. Always. Okay, next one is women receive back their dead by resurrection. I thought of two.
there's more than that, but
There's more than that, but in the Old Testament, we have in Elijah and Elisha. Happened, one is for Elijah and one Elisha. The first one is the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 to 24. The widow of Zarephath was not a Jew. She was a Sidonian. But God sent, this is during the big famine, God sent Elijah to Zarephath to escape the famine. And the famine was there because of Israel's gross idolatry and sin under Ahab and Jezebel.
Mhm.
And Elijah stayed with the widow, who was a Sidonian, but during his stay, the widow's son died. And God used Elijah to bring the boy back to life. The result was that the widow put her full faith in God. In 1 Kings 17:24, it says, and the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of God, the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. That was her statement of faith. And the second woman is the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 18 to 37. So the Shunammite woman was a wealthy woman who provided an apartment for Elisha. And Elisha kept coming through their town, and she told her husband, he said, well, here's this man of God coming into town. Let's make him an apartment, and he can stay there. He can stay at our house when he comes through and sleep and so forth. Had a nice bed and a desk and so forth and a lamp. And so that's what they did. They provided the apartment for Elisha. So Elisha wanted to do something for her, but they were wealthy and they didn't really need anything material. So Elisha told the woman she would have a son in 2 Kings 4, 15 to 17. Apparently she was barren and unable to have children. And so the son that she had was a miracle. But later, the little boy had grown up a little bit, and he went out to his father in the field when and he started having this terrible headache, and went back to his mother, and he died. And the Shunammite woman believed that God would use Elisha to bring her boy back. So she got on her animal and a donkey or whatever it was, a mule, and went and found Elisha. And he came back, and indeed, God honored her faith by giving her boy back to her, whole and alive.
Mhm.
And again, God was glorified.
I think that also the time that Jesus came across a funeral procession where the widow's only son had died, and he brought the son back to life. And that's when Mark Larry said, "When the dead sit up, the funeral's over."
Yes. Yes. So then I wanted to do one other of these statements in Hebrews 11. It says some were tortured, and then it goes on to say some were
But
tortured,
others.
but others. In Hebrews 11 verse 36 changed the tone, and he focused on men and women who were tortured and killed for their faith. And we could also catalog many other people, but I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about Jeremiah. Jeremiah is an interesting man. He was a Levite. He was called by God to be a prophet. Late in the reign of Josiah, the last good king of Judah. And then Jeremiah prophesied to the people of Judah until Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah had a very difficult life. You read the book of Jeremiah. Every time I read it, I feel so sorry for him. The people of Judah did not like the message of judgment God gave them through Jeremiah. So that they persecuted him, they beat him, they put him in stocks, they threw him in a pit a couple of times. He was imprisoned. He wrote a book of prophecy, and the king just read it and burned it. Could care less about it. And through it all, Jeremiah maintained his faith in God. He had moments of doubt, and you can read about those as you read through the book of Jeremiah, but he never wavered, really truly wavered in his faith for God. I don't know why God allowed so much bad stuff to happen to Jeremiah. He was a man at the time that God needed to tell the people the truth. But I know that in heaven, when Jeremiah got to heaven, God told him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Because truly Jeremiah did a beautiful thing. He did what God told him to do, even though it was very hard. That all of us, when we get to heaven, that God would tell us, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That's my goal. So what can we learn from these men and women of faith? Life is a struggle. All people have trouble in life, whether they believe in God or not. Everybody has trouble in life. I don't know, when I was in a workplace and I'd hear people talking and talk to people, everybody was having trouble. Nobody had a perfect life. Everybody struggles. The difference between non-believers and believers is that for believers, God stays at our side through the problems of life. God always gives us the strength to endure the trials of life.
Thus far.
That's right.
As far,
Yeah.
it's helped us.
One of the guys at church was just going through some tough times and struggling with some depression and this and that. And I was trying to encourage him. I told him I was praying for him. I stopped there in church and prayed for him. And I said, God will never leave you. And God gives us tough assignments. He gives us times in our lives that are really hard. But I said, here's what God does. I put my arm around his shoulder. I said, this is what God does during the tough times.
Yeah.
He puts his arm around us and says, I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to help you through it. And it's true. We've all experienced that in our lives. We've all experienced it. And Jeremiah is a great example. He suffered all through his life, but God was always at his side, helping him, sustaining him, guiding him. God, I love I love the fact that God is a loving Heavenly Father, and He knows what's best for us. And sometimes what's best for us is tough times. Sometimes what's best for us is tough times.
And God is not a magic wand that we wave and make things go away.
No,
He's not the vending machine from heaven. It's just, sometimes it's hard.
I was talking to our pastor right before we came on. He called, wanted to talk to me, and one of the things he preached about today was he was preaching about Joshua and Rahab and the spies and so forth. But he was saying that God, sometimes God, we pray and sometimes He heals. He was giving an example of his own stepdad who has been struggling with mesothelioma, which is a cancer caused by exposure to asbestos. And he got a PET scan, and his PET scan came back and he's completely clear. God healed him. He has no mesothelioma
It
left.
was stage 4.
There's none left in his body, no cancer cells left
They
in his
can't
body.
find him.
You can't find him. He's healed. But
But
he also said, but others, God doesn't always heal. And I told him about my own dad. My own dad had muscular dystrophy, and I think many of you have heard the story. And he prayed all through his life that God would heal him. And many people told him he didn't have enough faith because God had never healed him and so forth. And he told me at the end of his life, he said he was thankful that God didn't heal him because he was so proud that he said he would not have needed God. He probably wouldn't have followed God without it. And my dad's life verse was, my grace is sufficient for you. When you're weak, I'm made strong in your weakness. And so sometimes God puts us, He gives us tough assignments. He just does. He does. Sometimes I wonder what the next tough assignment's going to be.
Yeah.
But that's when we're in those tough assignments, that's when He shows Himself strong, and that's when He's closest to us.
Mhm.
And so throughout our study of Hebrews 11, we've seen God's power displayed dramatically for people who put their trust in Him. And so just as a summary of Hebrews 11, faith is the key to being a child of God. First, we can only become a child of God through faith. Second, life as a child of God is a walk of faith. And third, faith unlocks the power of God in our lives, in the life of the church. So, we just have to determine that we're going to be people of faith that God called us to be. We should be living expectantly, looking forward to the wonderful things God will do for us as we trust Him.
I think of Jesus in His lifetime. Look at all the times that He performed a miracle, and He would turn around and say, it was your faith that healed you, your faith in Jesus. But that it's one thing to believe, but you have to trust it.
Sure.
And He would say, it was your faith that.
But it
Faith
still
that
has
healed
to
you.
be also God's will.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I
But and
love-
also too, Romans tells us that, the trying times are the times when we grow. And
Yeah.
I think He knows that about us too, that
love
when we get on the top of the mountain, it's, we kind of
Yeah.
get some euphoria there, breathing in all that air.
I love this. I love the story of the blind man in John chapter 9. The disciple said, who sinned, the man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said, no,
Neither one.
neither one. He says, he was born blind so that God will be glorified, so God will be lifted up. And then He healed him. Sometimes for God's glory, people are going to go through some tough stuff, and God will always be glorified. always, always be glorified.
Yeah.
And this shouldn't be a somber thing. We should be joyful, knowing that, man, I look back and see all the wonderful things God has done. And I love your verse, Dorothy. Thus far, the Lord has helped us.
Oh, yeah. And miracles, many
Miracle.
miracles happen through adversity.
Yes.
They do.
You do.
they
Oh,
do.
I know that firsthand.
Yes.
So do we.
So, yeah, we all do. We've all experienced it. So, praise God. Any other questions or comments on this one?
Off to Hebrews 12.
Yeah, Hebrews 12 next time.
Good
Well,
job.
with a sneak peek back into Hebrews 11. Two
Gary,
verses.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Difference between raised from the dead and resurrection.
Those that were raised from the dead died again.
Okay, death is the difference.
Mhm.
The final death. Lazarus died once, but the final death. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I had been taught and everything, but I wanted an expert opinion.
Yeah.
Well, it isn't resurrection. Jesus did it himself. And with Lazarus, Jesus did that one too. So
That's-
Lazarus
well,
had nothing
the
to do with it.
resurrection, when Jesus was the first fruits of resurrection, when he rose from the dead, he came back with a new body, a glorified body. He had a real body because he was showing the disciples the nail prints in his hands and the spear, the scar from the spear in his side, and he ate food with them. But yet he could come and go and be gone.
Yeah, out through doors.
Well, I have another question, Gary. This is sort of an oddball question, but when he appeared in the upper room, which we feel he walked through the wall, does that include garments?
Well,
Yes.
he wasn't naked.
Yes.
Okay.
It doesn't say anything about streaking.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
No streaking.
Streamed. It was
I
the
don't
first
know.
instance of Zoom.
He did not, it doesn't say he walked through the walls. It just said he just showed up. So
He appeared.
he appeared, and whether he came through walls or just materialized where he wanted to be or Star Trekked it, we don't know.
But we're told by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 that we're going to have a body just like his in a resurrection. And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
All the ugly stuff will be left behind because the
That's
sin
right.
nature won't be there.
That's right. I'm going to stop the recording.